welcome. This is day 4 of IGDC. This is our last design session for the event, and it's been crazy. We had a lot of really amazing speakers, and it's good to know that we'll be closing really strong with someone very special, and we are very proud to have her a part of the event. She's currently the director of line game operations for Xbox Game Studios Publishing worldwide. Before joining Xbox in 2019, she actually spent 16 years as a game developer working on large-scale online games with teams from ArenaNet, Disney, Nexon. So over the course of her career, Crystin has focused on game design and direction, monetization strategy, and live ops, while also being active in the game developer community as a frequent speaker and writer, and especially about the ethics of monetization. So we welcome Crystin Cox.
Okay, so thank you so much for having me here and for the introduction. Today we're going to talk about behavioral psychology and game design with a little bit of an introduction into SDT, which I'm going to get into here. We're going to talk about what that means, but let's dig in. Today we're going to talk about game design. That's a big part of it, but we're also going to talk about psychology. And specifically, we're going to talk about the psychology of motivation and what motivates people to do things, and how we sort of came to understand that and how we can apply that psychology of motivation to video game design. But before we get into that, we need to lay some ground rules. Specifically, we need to really talk about what game design is and what game designers do. This can be a little bit tricky and vague because game designers actually end up doing a lot of different things at a lot of different studios. So if you are a game designer, you probably know that there are actually many different kinds of responsibilities and many different definitions about what a game designer is across many different studios. So for the purpose of this presentation, we're just going to use a definition that focuses on player experience. So we're going to sort of pull back and just think of designers as the people that shape the experience of the player. And specifically, designers do this in a couple of different ways. First, designers are the ones that provide structure for a game. So this is stuff like rules. If we're talking about board games, it would be, like this piece can move this way. If we're talking about video games, it could be things like this is the way that you win, or this is the way that you can, die or fail, or like if your hit points reach 0, then you have to start over, or things like that. This is the structure that sort of sets up what the foundation of the game is and how it works for the player. Designers also provide context. So this is things like the setting, or it could just be like enemy design, context for why you're doing the things that you are doing with the structure. So, it's one thing to say that this is a game where you try to move your units across the screen and get as many of them as you can through the enemy base. It's another thing to say, this is, a game about space marines on a distant planet and they're fighting against these aliens that look like bugs. All of that context is actually a big part of the player's experience and shapes a ton of how players experience the game. And designers are generally responsible for creating that context, sometimes through things as specific as, story and narrative, and sometimes for things as sort of vague and environmental as the shape of levels or the design of enemies. And finally, designers are also responsible for creating what I like to call resistance for the player. You could call it difficulty, but in some games that's not quite the right way to say it. This is the thing that pushes back against the player as they try to meet their goals. So we are responsible as designers for figuring out what that's going to be. because it's oftentimes not very satisfying for players to achieve goals if there is no resistance and there's nothing that they're overcoming, there's nothing that they're working through. So designers also need to shape the player experience by figuring out what resistance is going to look like. This example here, Breath of the Wild, is the stamina bar. You can't just climb forever. There's a point at which you run out of stamina, and that makes the game more interesting and more strategic for the player to experience. Sometimes resistance can be, enemies, boss designs, like in Dark Souls, resistance is these really difficult dexterity challenges. It can be all kinds of things, but as designers, it is our job to sort of create that experience for the players. Now, this sort of definition of what a designer does, I think, is not really that controversial. It's been around for a long time, but early in the history of game development, we really just kind of took all these elements, resistance, structure, context, and we just sort of mixed them up somewhat randomly, and not totally randomly. Like, we sort of thought, oh, I think this combination will be cool, and then we would just try it and see if it was fun. There wasn't really a lot directing us other than our gut instincts. We said, I think it would be neat if, we had this context and this structure and this resistance, and we mixed them all together, and we would make prototypes, and then hopefully they worked out. We would test them to see if they were fun, and that was sort of the way that game design worked for the most part. So this system had some pretty big downsides. For one, it created a lot of wasted time. We would actually have to do quite a lot of work to figure out whether or not our instincts were correct, and putting things together in this way was actually going to be fun. It also created some weirdly counterintuitive results. Like, we had these instincts, but sometimes they're totally wrong. Like, we would do something and then something totally unexpected would happen. And we didn't really know how to explain why it had turned out so differently than what we'd expected. We just had to keep testing. And finally, we didn't really have any way to predict which ideas were going to be the best ideas. Oftentimes we would get into rooms and just sort of throw out a lot of ideas, and we didn't really have a way to choose the best one other than just persuasive argument. Like, we would just sort of be, well, the person who feels the most passionately about their instinct is the one whose idea is going to get implemented to see if it works. All of this meant that the design process was pretty wasteful. And as games got more and more complicated and designs got more complicated, it became harder and harder to actually do it this way. So eventually we started asking the question, okay, well, why is something fun? Why is this thing fun and this thing not fun? So that we could try to figure out how to decide which things to actually spend our time implementing and which designs to actually go for. So we started asking this question in earnest to each other, usually at like conferences and when we met up with each other. This ended up being a little distracting because then we spent a lot of time arguing about the definition of fun. There was this whole period in game development where all we did really was argue about the definition of fun, and people wrote books about it and angry, forum posts. It was very difficult for us to actually come to consensus on what we meant by fun. And so it wasn't really all that helpful for us to figure out how to move forward with design. So eventually we started to say, okay, never mind. Let's not ask this question. It's too controversial. Let's try to find a way to ask the question in a little bit more of an objective way. And so instead we started to say, why do players want to and continue to do some things and not others? So we moved it away from the theoretical realm of fun and just started to say, why do players want to and continue to do things? Why do they do the things they do inside of our games? Or to put it another way, we asked, what's players' motivations? Like, what motivates them? Why do they want to do things? What we didn't know at the time, we eventually came to understand, is we were not the only people who cared about questions like this. For a long time, actually, psychologists had been wanting to know why people do anything. They were interested in understanding what motivates humans to do anything at all. And through many decades of research, they had actually come up with a model for human motivation that is called self-determination theory. So this is a model for why humans do things. I'm going to get into a lot more about self-determination theory in the next part of this, but first we're going to do a little bit of history of how we got to self-determination theory. When we realized, that this was out here, we were also surprised to find out that not only did psychologists want to know why people did things, they actually were using video games to figure it out. Psychologists already really loved video games and were doing tons of work in this space. Back in the early 2000s, some of these psychologists, specifically Dr. Ryan, Dr. Deci, Dr. Rigby, actually came together to create a company called Immersive. Immersive is a research company that focuses on lots of things, but one of the things they focus on is video games. Some of these guys, Dr. Ryan and Deci, actually are some of the authors of the original research for self-determination theory. They are on the board for Immersive, which has developed a specific model called PENS, which is player engagement through need satisfaction. This just specifically looks at why do players in video games do things, and how can we better understand that and apply that understanding to making better video games. So they've actually done tons of research. They've done thousands of hours of sort of observed play, and they've done thousands of surveys trying to understand why players do things in games. So psychologists want to understand why people do things, but they actually do use video games a lot in their research, and sort of Immersive is one example of this. Another example is Doctors Dujnet and Yi, who came out of Stanford in the mid-2000s. They formed a company called Quantic Foundry that is responsible for creating the gamer motivation profile. I recommend going and checking it out. It's very interesting. They actually launched a survey to try to understand why players prefer certain games. And that survey has had over 450,000 responses and has been correlated in a scientifically rigorous way, which is really cool. And they've used that to actually map out what it is about games that attracts certain people and create these profiles. I definitely recommend looking this up. You can actually go take the gamer motivation profile survey and find out where you fit into the gamer motivation model that they created. But the point is, these people were actually already looking at video games. They were psychologists who were doing research and were using that video games to advance that research and giving us some really good understanding of games. And so when we started to ask these questions as game designers, like why do people want to do some things but they don't really want to do others, it turned out there was actually quite a lot of research that had tried to answer these questions, and they had come up with some answers. They found some things in all their thousands of hours of study that were pretty consistent. One was that games that players spend more time with are more successful. This might seem sort of tautological, but hey, it's science. They have to prove even the most obvious things. So they did look into this, and yes, if players spend more time with the game, the more hours they spend with the game, the more successful that game will be. In success, meaning financial success, commercial success, and how much they say that they enjoy the game. Subsequently, players spend more time in games when the game meets their motivation needs. So when they looked at which games do players spend more time in? They are games that meet motivation needs. We're going to get to what those are. And then games that are designed specifically to satisfy those needs are consistently more successful. So when developers actually attempted to design towards meeting motivation needs, they make games that were more successful. So we sort of have this equation, right? Game design using self-determination theory equals players spend more time in game equals the game is more successful. It's so simple. It's not quite that simple, but it is very illuminating. I think it's very interesting to look at their research and see how consistent this finding was. It helps us sort of demystify why are some games successful and some games not. Why do players spend more time with one game A versus game B? So this seemed really important. So then we sort of said, okay, wow, this SDT thing is really important. These motivation needs seem really crucial to making players happy. So we had to say, hey, what is SDT, right? What is this self-determination theory and how does it work? So we're going to take a little bit of a trip through history to kind of understand human motivation understanding, sort of understand how we think about human motivation. For a long time, the only thing humans had to worry about was not dying, or this is the majority of what we worried about. For most of human existence, actually, our primary motivation was live. This meant we were primarily interested in meeting base needs like safety, food, shelter, all of those things that allowed us to stay alive. This was our primary motivator. For most of human existence, not only was this our primary motivator, we didn't really think a lot about other motivators because we were pretty busy thinking about how not to die. However, eventually, as we advanced, the need to find shelter and food and safety became less time consuming, right? We built a bunch of civilizations and systems and cultures that helped us sort of spread that work out so that we didn't have to spend all of our individual time just focusing on this motivation. Right around then, we have the introduction of the Industrial Revolution, which introduced the concept of work as we know it now. Because once people didn't need to spend all their time just taking care of their basic needs, we started thinking about how we could get groups of people to spend time doing something that wasn't necessarily directly related to their basic survival needs, but could be collectively useful. And this became known as work. This is sort of what we think is the modern concept of work. And when we wanted to get people to work, we had to start figuring out, well, how do we get them to work? If it's not something that's going to actually prevent them from dying, why would they want to do it? And we created this system and a model for understanding human motivation that is based around rewards and punishment. We sometimes call them carrots and sticks. And this became the dominant theory of motivation. We said, oh, okay, if you need to do something and it's not something, if we want people to do something and it's not something that directly, contributes to their survival, we need to either reward them to sort of entice them to do that thing. So if you think about a job, you need to get paid to do that job, right? We were like, people won't just do it because it's not directly related to their survival. So we have to pay them. And then subsequently, if you wanted people not to do something, we would punish them and say, well, if you do this, then you're going to get punished. So therefore, you should be deterred from doing it. You're not going to want to do it. And this theory of motivation, which is sort of the first formal theory of motivation, it sort of arises when we first have the concept of like human behavior psychology and philosophy starts to think about these things, was really, really dominant and very strong for a long time. People generally thought, even common people, this is the way humans work. If you want to get us to do something, you either have to reward us. If you don't want us to do something, you have to punish us. However, especially right around as we get into the 20th century, we can't really help but notice that there's a bunch of holes in this theory. There's a lot of things actually that people do that this theory does not explain. For one thing, people will make choices to do things that do not give them the highest reward. This is pretty consistent. People do this all the time. They make a choice to do something, even though a different choice would get them more money or more prestige or more somethings, more reward. But this happens all the time. People go like, I'm going to take the job I love instead of the job that pays the most money, or I'm going to sacrifice this to spend, time doing something else that I love, or I'm, going to, just buck the system and say like, I don't care about, these rewards. I'm going to do this for just my heart. This happens actually a lot, and it's been happening for a long time. So this is a hole in the carrot and stick motivation theory. It doesn't fit. It doesn't explain why this happens. Economists tried for a long time to say like, no, it does. There's just hidden rewards that you can't see that are somewhere down the line. But that never, that falls apart when we look at a lot of altruistic human behavior, and it doesn't really fit. Additionally, beyond just doing things that seem to not follow the need for rewards, we also see people do things like play video games. Honestly, playing games is one of the things that really pokes big holes into the carrot and stick theory. People will spend a lot of time getting good at games. And this is actually something that was going on well before video games. Like we can look at sports, we can look at games of chance, we can look at board games. People will spend a bunch of time doing this. They will spend time beyond just entertainment. They will practice, they will hone their skills, and these things will give them no noticeable rewards. And in fact, if you had children, you probably have seen this, you can also threaten to punish them if they don't stop doing it, and they might still keep doing it. Why are they doing that? The carrot and stick theory of motivation did not explain this. So eventually, scientists were like, wow, psychology is really becoming more of a science. Let's not just sit around like philosophers and imagine why this might be true. Let's actually do some research. Let's put people in rooms and observe them and actually do disciplined studies to try to figure out why people act the way that they do. So researchers, this is sort of back in the 40s and 50s, really started to hone in on saying, like, how can we design some studies to figure out why people are doing these things that don't seem to align with our theory of rewards and punishments. And they did that. They did a lot of studies. They tried to construct situations where they could measure these effects in people and figure out like why they were doing these things that seem so counterintuitive. And they came up with some really surprising results. If you're interested in sort of psychology research and stuff, there are a bunch of white papers out there and a bunch of research papers out there, but I picked a few really interesting ones. But when they were looking into motivation theory, they came up with some really surprising results in actual lab conditions. One was that when groups were offered a cash reward for solving a creative problem quickly, teams solved the problem much more slowly than when they were offered no reward at all. So if you took a group of people and said, I need you to solve this creative problem, go as fast as you can, there's no reward, they would go pretty fast. If you told them, I need you to solve this creative problem, and if you solve it the fastest, you'll get a cash reward, they went much slower, which seems very counterintuitive. Additionally, they also found that if they added a fine, so a deterrent, for arriving late to something, more people arrived late than before. Many more actually arrived late than before. These were really interesting findings, and they were actually done in scientifically controlled experiments. And so they said, this is really something. There's something going on here. We need to explain it. So they did a couple decades more research. I won't go that deeply into it. But at the end of all of that, they came up with a theory, self-determination theory. This theory ultimately says people are happiest and most productive when their actions are stimulated by intrinsic motivators as opposed to extrinsic rewards and punishments. Intrinsic motivation is inherent in all humans and can be classified into three types: mastery, autonomy, relatedness. Ultimately, what this means is that there are these things other than extrinsic rewards and punishments that motivate us to do things. And in fact, they're very strong motivators. They're inherent inside of us. I mean, we can't really get rid of them. And they can be classified into these three types, which is very useful for us. So this is the answer to our question. Why do people do things? Because it gives them mastery, autonomy, or relatedness. This is a model. It literally, it's not meant to be, the perfect truth about what motivates people, but it is a good model. It's a model that's backed up by a lot of research, and we can look and see that it's been very successful. So I think it's a useful model for us to use in game development, and it can really help us understand better why our players do things. So I'm going to dive into each one of these: mastery, autonomy, and relatedness, and talk specifically about how it relates to games. How do we see these motivations show up in game design? So we'll start with mastery. This is the need to be effective, to be skilled, and to grow. And this shows up in a bunch of ways, but I'm going to talk about three big ones. The first is novelty. So we crave novelty. We want to see things we haven't seen. It makes us feel like we're growing because it makes us feel as humans as if we are now have access to more data and more information about the world. This is the reason that you feel a sense of satisfaction when you travel and you see new things or you try new food. It makes you feel like you now know more. Your skill has improved. This is true in games very much. Players want to experience new things, see new things, have unique experiences happen to them. This really feeds their desire for mastery. And a lot of games have this, and it is a reason a lot of games are successful, is because they offer this kind of mastery to players. The next type of mastery is something we call RPG growth. This is experience bars filling up. So this is like the representation of skill gain. But as we're going to talk about in a second, it's not actual skill. So as I level up my archery in Skyrim, I don't actually, as the player, learn to shoot a bow and arrow. My character does, and it's represented here by this progress bar. It lets me know my character is now more skilled. This is also the kind of mastery that's in levels of all kind, the ability to take on new challenges in a game or complete a quest you couldn't complete before. All of these things are RPG growth. It's a type of growth. It's somewhat simulated, but it does activate that desire to have more mastery because your character is becoming more effective and more skilled. Usually RPG growth is a pretty simple equation of player puts in time, character grows. And that can feel incredibly rewarding and really hit that mastery desire because it's very consistent. If I put the time in, I know my numbers will go up. That's very comforting, but it also makes me feel very satisfied. The last type is actual skill acquisition. This is the actual building of real skill. So if you're playing a PvP game, this is actually your ability to execute more effectively against your opponents. So I'm using, League of Legends here or Dota 2. Those are good examples. As you learn the game, you actually get better at playing it. That's real skill acquisition. This is the most sticky and effective mastery motivator in games is real skill acquisition. However, it is also the slowest and hardest to acquire for players. So you kind of get into a catch-22 a little bit with skill acquisition. It's much harder to create, and many players will actually fall off of it because if they're not seeing quick enough growth, they'll actually abandon the game. But if you can do it well and carry players along, it is the most sticky. Games that have probably the highest satisfaction scores and the longest running times are generally have some kind of skill acquisition involved in them. So that's mastery. The next type of motivation we see is autonomy. This is the need to experience personal agency, meaningful choice, and volition. It's important to say autonomy is not a perfect synonym for freedom because you can be free to do things and still not feel like it's meaningful in any way. Just having lots of choices doesn't necessarily activate great autonomy satisfaction. It generally is personal agency and meaningful choice that does. And in games, like the first type of autonomy is choice. It is the ability to make a decision. You see this in branching narratives. You see this in tech trees. You see this in all kinds of things. It needs to be a meaningful choice to activate my feeling of autonomy, to make me feel like I have volition in this experience. That's very motivating for people. This is actually, autonomy is one of those things that people can struggle to find in their day-to-day life, especially children. Don't get this need met very often. Maybe theoretically, people have posited it's one of the reasons children like games so much, is it allows them to explore autonomy in a safe space. But everybody likes it. It's something that's really motivating for us, is the ability to have some control and to make choices that matter, that you get to make. And so this can be very motivating in games. The next way that we see autonomy in games is identity autonomy. So this is the ability to actually express yourself. You see this sometimes in like character creators, but you also see this in RPGs where you get to make choices about the way your character or you, the player, would go about doing something. This isn't necessarily a binary choice like a dialogue tree, but it could be a choice, a strategic choice, like, well, I want to solve my problems with stealth instead of solving my problems with force. That would be a part of autonomy, of identity autonomy. I'm getting to express myself and be myself. And sometimes it can just be visual, but a lot of times it is even more engaging and motivating for players when it actually is also manifest in the actions that you take in the game. Finally, we can have autonomy through exploration, the ability to go where you want and see new things. So when you see the things, your mastery might be satisfied, but the ability to go do that will satisfy your autonomy need. This is like an old cliche of like, see that mountain, you can go there. There's a reason that was compelling. There's a great feeling of autonomy when you are able to explore and move freely through a game world. You see this also in Metroidvanias, where there's this great satisfaction when, oh, now I can get to that room I couldn't get to before. This is activating my autonomy. I now can do that. I have this choice. I can go where I want to go. So that's autonomy. Now we're going to round out to the last motivator, which is relatedness. This is the need for meaningful connection with others. So humans are a very social species, and this is a core motivator for us. We see it show up in video games in a lot of ways. The first is maybe the most obvious is story. Telling stories is one of the ways that humans create meaningful connection with each other in general. And so video stories in games can add relatedness. You can have characters that you relate to, or you may see yourself in a story or have a meaningful reflection about yourself from playing a story in a video game. It can help you inhabit different roles. All of these things can contribute to your feeling of relatedness with the game and with other people. So this is something that games can do. It's, I think, tricky in games because autonomy is also so important. So it's not as passive as experiencing a story through a film or television or a book, but it is still something that can help us feel relatedness by crafting these interesting characters or situations or plot lines. The next is shared goals. So this can come in the form of things like you need to join a particular faction that makes you feel like, oh, I feel a kinship to other people in this faction. Or it can just be co-op games where we are going to get together and share literal goals, that we're going to have quest objectives that we share and work towards together. Or even competitive team games can do this. All of this means shared goals really help people feel connected to each other, and they can be a big motivator to continue playing a game, either from a meta level, like maybe your shared goals are, I have a rating group that I need to get together with every X number of days, or just on an individual level of, in this moment we have a shared goal, and so that's creating a meaningful motivation for me to do this together with you, which creates relatedness. The last type of relatedness that games deal with a lot is culture. So culture is the idea that there is relatedness to be had in sharing experiences together, usually around the same time. So we see this happen in sports, right? Like, if you follow a sports team and you can go talk to a friend about it, you feel related to them. You both saw the same sporting event. The same thing happens with games. Right now, a lot of people are playing Among Us. That's a cultural moment. And I'm motivated to go play that now because I want to share that cultural moment with other people and discuss it with them in a way that's meaningful. Games do this a lot. Games are culture. Even games that are not of the moment. When I meet people who've played and enjoyed a game that I enjoyed years ago, we immediately have a connection. And that can be very motivating in a meta sense, to continue to play games or like have an expanded library of games that you have interacted with. So culture is also something that games can activate for motivation, and it's something that you can design for. It's something that is actually worth looking into and thinking about if you haven't, that it is actually something you can design towards. Okay, so that is a general overview of just some of the basic ways that we see the self-determination theory motivations manifest inside of games. To take this into a little bit more of a practical realm, I'm going to wrap it up by just talking about a couple of things that you can do right now with SDT that is a useful design tool. So the first one is SDT can really help you consider your design through the lens of player experience. A lot of times as designers, we think of our design as a list of features to be completed, to sort of check off a list. But that's not the way players experience our game. SDT can help us get into that mindset by asking questions like, what is going to be the motivator for players when they experience this quest or this feature? Like, how are they going to feel motivated? What are they going to feel? Can we think about that through the lens of self-determination theory and give it names and more structures? We can better put ourselves in that position, because it is hard, right? Like, because as a designer, you do in fact need to think about your features as a list of features you need to implement, and you need to think like a designer, but you also need to think like a player, and SDT can really help you do that by giving you a structure to build that thinking around. Additionally, SDT can help you focus in on identifying what emotions and motivations you want to engage. Instead of randomly putting things together by instinct, you can say, I want this game to be about autonomy, or I want this game to be focused on mastery. I want this feature or this quest even to be about this thing. And that can really help you narrow your choices and make your game feel more focused because you are specifically trying to do something. Most games have elements of all three motivators in them. So this isn't to say like you need to choose one and make your game all about that. But especially when you're in the weeds of figuring out exactly how to make choices for individual features or parts of your game, using SDT to focus you and your team can really help you figure out what you want to accomplish instead of just what you end up with. Additionally, it can help you really think about that balance between extrinsic and intrinsic rewards. SDT does not tell us that extrinsic rewards are completely unimportant or don't exist. They do. People want to get rewarded for things. People respond to being punished. Those are real. But it can be easy to fall into the trap of believing, like we did, 150 years ago, that is the whole of human motivation. SDT can help us balance that out and say, okay, I do want to have rewards that are just, straight up, gold or gear or death penalties or whatever. But I also want to balance that out by making sure there are also moments where there's intrinsic rewards, like we achieved something, I gained skill, I felt a relatedness moment. SDT can really help you articulate that and come to understand how to balance that out in your game. So those are some things you can do with SDT, but there's also one more thing I want to talk about, which is a warning to be careful. So as a designer, especially as you learn more about behavioral psychology, you are a professional manipulator. It's your job to manipulate people into having fun. Hopefully, you're going to use those skills for good. SDT can help us understand how to be a better steward of our player experience, right? How to make games more enjoyable for players. But it can also lead you down the road of saying, oh, interesting. Players are motivated by these things. And as I said, these are inherent motivations. You cannot choose to not be motivated by mastery. That's not something that is easy for people to do. Maybe it's impossible. That means you can manipulate that motivation. And you need to be careful to not do that in a way that's going to be against the interest of your players. There's a lot of important discussions, I think, to be had, especially in the coming years, about the ethics of engagement. We know that there are certain things we can do that will get players' attention and keep them engaged. We need to start thinking about how much we should be doing that and when it becomes hurtful. You need to be aware of what we call dark patterns. So dark patterns are circumstances or actions that cause people to act against their own self-interest. And they're consistent. We know that we can actually test them. Like you see stuff here, like the fear of missing out. It can be fun. It can be fun to do things that are short-lived, and it can create a great cultural moment, but it can fall into a dark pattern where you're just manipulating people to do something they don't want to do and getting them to act against their own self-interest. So it's a careful balance. And as designers, it's part of our job to be aware of that and not be, and to know that that can happen so that we can prevent it from happening. So to wrap it up, game design, I believe, is applied behavioral psychology. I think it's important for game designers to spend time learning about behavioral psychology. We're not doctors. You're probably never going to, maybe you'll be so inspired, you'll go become a researcher, but you're probably not going to do that, and that's fine. But what you do is incredibly affected by human psychology. And so it's worth your time as a designer to go research this and understand it and apply it to the way that you make games. That's the end of my presentation. I have this appendix with a bunch of links. I think I can upload this stuff for you guys, I believe, so that you can actually hit these links and you don't have to write them down or anything. But there's some good white papers and videos that you can watch that just dive a little bit deeper into self-determination theory. If that's something that you want to research more, I highly recommend it. If you're just looking for an introduction to self-determination theory that's like pretty easy to absorb, I highly recommend the book Drive by Daniel Pink. It's really easy to read. It's a business book, so there's a little bit of businessy stuff in it, but it still has a lot of really useful stuff in it, and it's very easy to understand even if you don't have any kind of science background. So I am going to stop presenting, but as I said, I think we can make this available to all of you so that you can grab those links later, and we're going to move over to questions.
We have a question from Aisha. She asked, how do you discover the user need? And wouldn't it be subjective across user groups?
Yeah, so one of the reasons SDT is pretty useful is we do know that that's it's sort of universal human needs for these motivators. But it is pretty blunt. All right, there's three of them, but they're universal, which is great. So you can start there and know if I do something that satisfies these needs, people are going to be motivated by it. People are going to be affected by it in a positive way. But as you, I think, are alluding to, there's much more granular versions of this when we start to get into player preference and player profiling, where people are going to have strong preferences for particular kinds of mastery. Like there's going to be people who are, this is a very simple example, like who don't like PvP. Even though that does hit a mastery motivation, they don't like it. They would prefer to get their mastery from RPG growth. Figuring that out is a lot of work in sort of market research. But the advice I would give to designers is to make it part of your process to at least think through these questions. Who is your audience and what do they want? And you can think about that from a top-down perspective where you actually go, well, what do I see out in the market? Like, what do I see the commonalities in games that are very popular? Those are the things I should go to. But I also suggest you do bottom-up, where you ask, what kind of game do you want to make? What kind of players do you want to have? Because there's no such thing, I don't believe, maybe someday we'll get there and with AI or machine learning. I don't think there's such thing as a universally appealing game. So you do have to ask yourself who you want to focus on and make priorities. And I actually think if you do that and you're honest with your research about, if you say, I really want to make a game that appeals to people who love dancing and strategy, that might be a small niche. Like you can look out and see like how many games have both of those things and how well that they do. But at least you're asking that question so that you don't, go down the road of either making a game that's so niche you're never going to succeed at your goals, or trying to please everybody and then making something that doesn't really feel that motivating to anybody.
We have a question from Luca. How could a team sort out which are the best fitting design choices against specific player need satisfaction?
Yeah, I think one of the best ways to do it is to actually do the exercise. This sounds very basic, but oftentimes that discipline is the thing that really gets you there. Do the exercise of actually listing out the features you're considering and actually identifying which of the motivators it does activate. Because even just doing that can really give you clarity on what you're actually doing. Especially when a lot of times when we design features, we can fall into the trap of designing things for us, the designer, like this is what I would like because of personal preferences. And so when you actually sit down and say, no, I'm going to write down for every single one of these features what it is the player is going to get out of it. Like what is the player going to get out of this feature? It can really help you figure out what you're actually doing and where you're actually heading. Then you can actually look at that list of things and say, okay, let's say we've got a lot of these features and when I look at them, honestly, what's motivating players about them is all relatedness. You can then take that and look at it from a meta level of, okay, what genre are you in? is that genre one that you think people are coming to for relatedness? When you look at other competitive games, do you see the same kind of motivations in them? Because expectation setting is often the most important thing when you're talking about satisfying a potential audience's needs. When we're talking about a game that's already live, a lot of times you can actually test this stuff. You can actually do A/B testing by saying, like, let's build this feature in a way that we think is really going to push towards autonomy versus let's build this feature in a way that's going to push towards mastery, and then sort of check it out. You can also look at the kinds of activities the players are gravitating towards in your game and what motivators those activate to see what your audience prefers. I highly recommend looking at Quantic Foundry's research because they do actually talk a lot about player profiles, and it's backed up by actual research. So they actually have like a lot. They've surveyed hundreds of thousands of players. So you can see like these are the actual activities that sort of motivate players to do things in games and dictate whether or not players say they like a game.
We had one question from Joel Johnson. He asks, does SDT help with understanding why social casino games tend to have high engagement?
Yes. So casino games in general activate a couple of things really strongly. One, they actually activate relatedness, which is maybe a little counterintuitive, but this is something that like casinos have known forever. Like there's a reason that casinos have a party atmosphere and that the people bring you, drinks and stuff like that, because it's a cultural event and it's something that you can talk about. Anything with random chance actually activates this because we love to tell stories about how we got something randomly or rarely. Like we really like as humans to be like, oh my gosh, it was a 1 in a million chance and this thing happened for me. So that really activates that sense of relatedness. But it also activates a sense of RPG growth. This is actually gets into a little bit of dark patterns. There are things about the human brain that are, you might call them bugs, like in software. They're just quirks that we do as humans, even though they're maybe not great for us. And one of them is that we believe in luck. It's not something you can really help. Your brain is wired to do it. Like you can, if you realize it, you can do work to counteract it. But we believe in luck. And so we believe that when we see random events, there's a pattern and it's heading towards something or it's building to something, which can create this like really strong sense of RPG growth type mastery. It's not real at all. Like randomness is random, and like I guarantee you, like casino games have real random number generators. There's nothing that's happening that's going to favor you, but it's a kind of a bug in the human brain. Like we can't really help it. We see patterns when they're not there, and it's very enticing to us. Like, we really love this idea. It's very hard to resist it. I think that so casino games can satisfy that. They can make you experience that. But they have a little bit of a danger. You have to really be careful with them because you can easily cross over into the other side where you can binge on it and like have great amounts of regret, and players can be really unhappy if they like have these feelings of like it's growing, I'm going to get lucky, and then it never happens for them. So they're tricky to balance in a way that keeps players happy for a long time, but it can be done. But you really are just activating this sort of interesting quirk of pattern recognition in the human brain where we think that randomness equals some kind of growth or arc.
So we have about 10 minutes left. Quite a few questions are still left, so I'm just going to gun these. How do you get players' attention in a way that it makes sense to them and feels meaningful instead of doing it just because it is a part of the game?
Right. So attention's a really interesting field of study, actually. There's a bunch of really interesting research on attention. If you have access to GDC Vault, I recommend finding a talk from a couple years ago that's called The Design of Time by Chelsea Howe. It's a really interesting talk where she talks about attention. But just generally, we have to think, I think the thing we fall into, the trap we fall into, is we're like, we need to get people's attention. And so we tend to do these really like dramatic things like pop-ups or like, this is the most important thing that's ever happened. You need to do this. But we know somewhere in our instincts that as humans, that is going to have really diminishing returns. And that's because when we do those things, when we try to like grab attention, we are activating this sort of fear mechanism in our brain. Like we're saying, there's a threat. And you have to pay attention to this or something bad's going to happen to you, which is like a lizard brain part of us. It's not like high functioning brain. So what can happen there is that when you activate that by like grabbing someone's attention, you then have to deal with the fact that you have sort of depressed their cognitive abilities. Like you've activated the kind of fight or flight mode. So they don't really think things through. And that can make it actually not stick very well, right? Because when you put people in that mode of like, you need to deal with this really quickly right now, you actually repress their ability to make a strong connection to that decision because they're in the moment. It's not about long-term thinking anymore. It's about short-term thinking. So it can be difficult to figure out how to build up meaningful attention with players. From my experience, there's no shortcut. It really is about building trust and consistency with players in delivering things that satisfy them. So if you're worried about actually making that connection with your players and having them remember it or feel really motivated by it, focus on satisfaction instead of attraction. We spend a lot of time worried about attraction. How do I get your attention? Focus a little bit more on how am I going to feel after the interaction? Like, because that's really what matters for making that lasting impact is that after I do the thing with you, how am I going to feel? Am I going to feel satisfied? Am I going to feel really happy? Am I going to then start anticipating doing it again because I really enjoyed that experience? That's going to create a much deeper motivation with your players. It also is harder and takes longer. I mean, I won't lie. Like it's a slow and steady thing. I will use sometimes like the metaphor of any kind of relationship. If you met someone for the first time and they wanted to be your friend, if they kept running up to you and screaming in your face and like demanding that you pay attention to them, you probably wouldn't develop much of a connection with them. But if you had consistent positive interactions with them, you would then go start seeking them out because you want to be their friend. And it isn't that different when we talk about live ops games and games that you're going to have a long-term relationship with. Little bit different if you're talking about a single player game that you're only going to play once. Then you actually can focus a little bit more on the big dramatic moments, and it's fine because you don't need people to come back later. You just need them to have this experience. But when we're talking about games that you want people to come back to over and over again, you really want to build up that relationship over time so that there's real trust there instead of it feeling like a trick.
Please tell us how games could influence a player like Breath of the Wild does.
So Breath of the Wild is a great example of this. Breath of the Wild does a few really, really clever things, especially right at the beginning, that are very focused on motivation. One is there's a moment after you're tutorialized where you're at the top of the plateau and the game has a sweeping view of the world that really activates your exploration motivation, both from a mastery and autonomy perspective. It's just that moment you are promised as a player, I'm going to explore this world. I'm going to have the opportunity to see all these cool, unique things. I just saw this little microcosm of it, and I saw things happen that were very motivating. Things like, if I have fire, I can set things on fire. That makes me feel like I have tons of volition in the world. I affect the world. I'm really important. This is so motivating. I'm also being told that the fate of the world depends on me, right? That activates a lot of relatedness. Like, people are depending on me. We have these shared goals. I need to go out there and do these things. And then you see that big sweeping pan and you're like, wow, there's going to be so much of this great experiences. This world is probably full of cool volitional experiences where I affect the world and my choices make a difference. That's very, very motivating. Breath of the Wild hits autonomy really hard. I can climb anywhere, I can go anywhere. And when I do, I see interesting things happen that are affected by me and the things that I do in the game. Wow, that's such a motivating experience. So motivating that, I think that it really paves over some of the things in the game that other games might have struggled with. I don't think every game can put a weapon system in where weapons break and have players not be frustrated, but they did a great job of rolling that into this makes sense because I am having this effect on the world, and so it makes sense that these things are breaking, so I need to go out and get more of them. That sort of thought really allowed them, I think, to do things with that game that I think other games would have struggled to pull off. Love Breath of the Wild. Such a great game.
Ashwant asks, is mastery on common ground with flow theory, as that too talks about mastering about performance, while the player gamer is in the flow channel?
Yeah, that's an interesting. It's an interesting overlap between the two. So if you dig really deeply into skill acquisition and then skill execution, you will like run into flow theory. It's more about flow is really more about execution of skill and a little bit less about the acquisition of skill. But it is important if you are going to make a game that is really focused on skill acquisition and mastery, I definitely recommend looking at flow theory so that you can get an understanding of what it looks like when you are having a satisfying experience as a player of executing your skill. I just spent a bunch of time developing the skill. Now I'm in this flow where I'm challenged just enough to push me and keep me really, really engaged to keep going. There are people who have spent years doing nothing but trying to perfect matchmaking algorithms to generate flow state for players who are playing competitive games. It's very challenging for a bunch of reasons to do it, but that's like the whole point of why we want to match you against the best players who are going to give you the most chance at flow, which is they're right around your level, but they're just a little bit challenging so that you can get to that flow state. But it's a good point. Like if you're doing something with mastery, I think it's totally worthwhile to look at the way that the motivation to gain mastery feeds into the desire to then feel the flow state, which sort of creates a virtuous loop.
Zarina asks, like you said, fun is a difficult term to define. Similarly, it's been quite challenging to define the term learning. Any thoughts on how SDT can help with creating meaningful learning games, keeping young learners' needs in mind and not consumer, parents, educators, experts, perceptions? I am so sorry for
this is a really, really interesting question. Learning is interesting. It's skill acquisition mostly, but the trick I think that we find in learning, and we run into this all the time, if you do want to make a game that's about skill acquisition, you will run into this problem where the acquisition of skill requires practice. And it requires focused practice. And generally, research has shown focused practice is not really fun. It's not something that people report enjoying. It's hard. It takes real effort. And so one of the things that we spend a lot of time doing in games where you need to build skill is using the other motivators to try to get you through that hump, because you're going to have to practice and it's going to be hard. Because if you don't practice, you don't actually get better. And practice needs to be focused and it needs to be difficult, or you won't actually gain skill. This is the reason you'll actually see this. There's a bunch of research into this. If you look at like how skill acquisition works from a pedagogy point of view, there is a bunch of research on this where people say like, if you just play 1,000 games of chess, you will not get better at chess. You have to play them in a focused way of attempting to learn things about chess and learn new skills. If you don't do that, if you just passively move the pieces based on their rules, you actually could play chess for years and years and years and not really get any better at it at all. And so that trick, that unfortunate reality of like, in order to actually get better at something, in order to learn something, you have to practice and really engage, I think does mean games have a lot they could give to education, because we have figured out a bunch of ways to motivate people to do stuff, and to get over that hump of like the stuff that maybe is like a little bit less fun. You can look at things like, I look at things like Pokemon and say like, wow, you can get people to learn the names of a million Pokemon and like remember them forever because they do all of these other motivating things. It's not fun to sit down and memorize Pokemon names, but you do end up doing it because the game is motivating you to do things that like encourage that behavior. So I think there's a lot that game design could bring to education. I think the danger is game designers thinking that we just gamify everything and then that's going to solve all of our education problems, which I don't think is true. I think it really takes so much. You have to also have that experience as an educator and take those experiences really seriously to create that good mix. But it's a fascinating field. Like I definitely think there's something to be said there, and I definitely think self-determination theory could be applied very, very well to education.